Welcome to Beardy, Bruce Lee Central, the biggest Bruce Lee channel on the planet.
Hey everybody, it's Birdie here. What's going on, guys? Okay, so a long time ago, I read this article that said that Bruce Lee punched James Coburn and that James Coburn flew backwards and basically Bruce Lee almost killed him. And I could never confirm the article to be true or not. So I forgot all about it. And recently I was restoring an old VHS, not only one, but several old VHSs. And I've been able to find a bunch of interviews, Chuck Norris, James Coburn, Jim Kelly, Steve McQueen, a lot of the stars and martial artists from that era. And I restored the VHS and I found this interview where James Coburn actually confirms that Bruce Lee punched him with a 1-inch punch, and this is what happened. Take a look.
So Bruce came over to the house, and I was living over on Tower Road, and it was just filled with energy, just boom, just bursting with energy. And so we talked for a little bit, and he said, "What have you been doing here?" And then I said, "Well, all I've done is that thing." "Yeah, but you did a lot of flicky stuff, flicky, bang, nothing really." I said, "Oh, really?" And he said, "I've got a 1-inch punch that is better than anything you did." And I said, "Really? I'd like to see that." And he said, "Got a pillow?" And so I stood up, put a pillow in front of me, and hold it, and bang, like that, knocked me into the chair. The chair fell down. I rolled over into the corner with a 1-inch punch. I got up and I said, "Let's go to work, man. That looks like fun."
Today, and again, we're here at the National Convention for Jiu-Jitsu America, and we're here with CJ James Demile, again, the founder of Chundo and personal student of the late, great Bruce Lee. Again, CJ Demile, it's a pleasure meeting you, sir.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Great opportunity to hopefully share some thoughts with your audience.
Fantastic. First of all, sir, let's go, we were talking a little bit earlier, let's go a little bit into your background and how you got involved in the martial arts.
Well, I, first of all, got into the martial arts when I was in the military back in 55, 56. I was a heavyweight champ of the Air Force at that period of time, and I was sort of a rough and tumble fighter. I had spent 12 years of my early life in an orphanage, and I always believed that if you wanted to get something, you had to fight for it. And so my interpretation or perception of myself was based on how tough I was. And those were the early years. And then getting into the martial arts itself, as we know it today, karate, kung fu, all that, was mainly because of Bruce Lee, of meeting Bruce Lee in the early years. That was 1959. And from there, of course, I've spent many years in training and becoming a teacher and starting my own system. So
That's quite an accomplishment. Tell me something. Again, let's go back a little bit, back to 1959. How did you first meet Bruce Lee?
Well, one of the things, like I say, I was kind of a street punk, and I liked to fight, and I thought I was getting a lot of respect as a fighter. And what I didn't realize is the difference between respect and fear. And a lot of people feared me. So whenever I had an opportunity to impress someone, I did. And where I was going to school was a school in which adults were doing makeup credits to get into the university. And there was a young gentleman there who was from Hong Kong who was putting on a demonstration about martial arts from China, Kung Fu, and I'd never heard of it. And so I thought, well, I have an open class, I'll go watch what he says. And here I see this little 135-pound, 5'7" individual leaping around like a butterfly, doing all kind of fancy moves, talking about how effective it was in fighting. And I was rather amused. So afterwards, I went up to him and I said, "Hey, kid, no disrespect, but that stuff isn't going to work. We don't fight bugs over here. We're men." So he said, "Well, gee, why don't you take a punch at me?" Well, there were some girls around, and it was one of those moments where, I could impress everybody. So I took a punch at this guy. Bad mistake. This guy did what they call trap me, locked me up, and tapped on my forehead and said, "Is anybody home?" So he embarrassed me greatly, but at the same time, it was not only an embarrassment at that point in time relative to the people around, but it was such a shock to me because I had never been immobilized, stopped, trapped, so effortlessly in my life, and so I had to step back and reevaluate. Gee, how tough was I, and who really was I? If I wasn't that tough, then gee, who was Jim Demile? So this young gentleman's name was Bruce Lee, and he was just starting out himself and starting to train to become the best fighter there ever was. So I happened to come into his life at a time by accident where I became part of that original group of training and developing what were to become his fighting skills. And but not only did it help Bruce, but it just revolutionized my own perceptions and feelings about myself and about what martial arts was to me. It was no longer a caveman Neanderthal mentality. It became something where there truly was an art to martial arts. And not only was it an art, but it was a positive thing because it helped you gain more respect for yourself. And I then began to change. I began to grow. I began to mature. And here I am, how many years later, still doing it? 1995 and started in 1959.
Wow, that's incredible. Tell me something. You, again, the art of Wing Chun Do. How does, again, we talk about the evolution of various martial arts. Again, your base, of course, with Bruce Lee was Wing Chun. But I've been very fortunate, of course, being a martial arts historian, to have read your books. And I'm still kicking myself for not bringing them with me today, of course. But I wanted to find out what put you on the path to evolve into what is now known as Wing Chun Do.
Well, a number of factors. One is that I found that most of the people who were interested in learning the martial arts were just everyday people. They weren't martial artists. They didn't want to be tough or beat up anybody. They just didn't want to be beat up themselves. They were the everyday worker, the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker. So I began to think, well, you don't really have to teach somebody to be tough who's tough already. I mean, big and mean. What the martial arts is really for is the person who is not big and mean, who wants to defend themselves, but it was too abstract. It was not geared for the average individual. It was just geared for the martial artist. So I decided to go through everything that I knew and begin to formulate a very simple, effective way of developing self-defense that would work for anyone, regardless of age, size, sex, physical condition. And so Wing Chun Do is based on no strength, being able to develop natural movements, natural skills that once you learn them, it's like biking and swimming, you know them forever. Also, the attitude is that the more you learn, the better you get, the less violent you become, the less prone to violence you become, because you have more confidence, you believe in yourself, and therefore you feel more secure, and therefore able to pass up threatening situations that you never would before. So there's just things about the needs of the people that I have known and gotten involved with that helped me formulate Wing Chun Do from the basic skills that I developed in the early years with Bruce. Plus, I was a hand-to-hand combat instructor out at Fort Lewis, Washington, teaching the Special Forces, the Green Berets, for a couple of years. And I teach military and police all over the world today. I'm going to Australia next month to do some teaching for the government. So all of this is just to bring together things that I learned in my travels. One of the most fantastic experiences I've had and one of the greatest learning experiences is from Professor J in the small circle jiu-jitsu concepts, because it fits in very well with where I'm coming from, but it also can be done by anybody. And so it's in the travels, in the experiences that I gain, do I search out those simple, efficient, and practical things that will fit into Wing Chun Do for the average individual who is not a martial artist and is not violent, but yet must work in that split second when some idiot wants to bother them or their family. So.
Now, in the evolution of Wing Chun Do, you were mentioning you had a very interesting story. You are quite an educated man yourself. Could you explain a little bit about your educational background as well, and the story that went with your journey into collegiate education?
Well, I have a master's degree in psychology, a doctorate in hypnotherapy from Sussex, England. And the reason I got into the field itself is because of my own interest in understanding myself. I was in a lot of personal conflict and trying to organize myself, and I felt that I needed a lot of technical information to do that. And so I was very self-orientated. But as I became more involved, I began to see that there was something that in my martial arts experiences and teaching, there was also psychodynamics that needed to be placed into the teaching spectrum relative to the students itself. And so I began to integrate a lot of the less aggressive and invasive psychological concepts that a student could use, just like any technique, to help them build more confidence, to kind of bring more harmony and balance to their thinking, without, again, interfering with their life or telling them what they should or shouldn't do. And so my technical background, professional academic background, has just been very contributory towards really making martial arts a very balanced art. And it's given me a tremendous amount of satisfaction to see the results over the years as students not only grew physically in their competence relative to self-defense, but in just the belief and the excitement about who they are and what they could accomplish as a person.
Well, that's so refreshing to hear again, developing, and we talk about it so many times in the martial arts, but here is yet another example of developing individuals mentally and psychologically as well as physically, so that, as they always say, the battle begins in the mind, and to achieve that state of harmony. Tell me, again, for the average person who is not familiar with Wing Chun, could you explain a little bit about the base of Wing Chun Do in the physical realm, and a little bit about the art itself?
Okay, well, Wing Chun itself is a classical system started about 400 years ago in China. And it's a beautiful system. It's a very flowing, very dynamic, very efficient system. However, when Bruce Lee came to the United States, he found that the potential aggressive people over here were much bigger and stronger and were difficult to hurt. So although the techniques were very effective in many ways, they lacked certain features to really effectively, efficiently take out a much larger Western fighter. So he began to modify certain things about the speed and the power and the control of the opponent. Somebody who might be 200 pounds more than him. Well, in my own evolution of Wing Chun Do, what I did is I looked at the concepts I'd learned from Bruce Lee, and decided, well, wait a minute, many of these things were designed for Bruce Lee. He wanted to become the best fighter. Therefore, although they were very effective for Bruce Lee, were they going to be effective for Mary Jane down the street, or this kid, or whatever? And a lot of it really needed to be tweaked and changed a little bit so it became more universal. Things about speed and power, technical techniques. And so when I began to study, the history of the system and everything else, that relative to Wing Chun, I began to see that there were certain features that anybody could do. And so when I began to develop Wing Chun Do, I began to look at the type of person who was going to learn and design the actual techniques to fit these people. Rather than to try and make the person adapt to the technique, what we had is sort of a concept that was adaptable to fit the individual, so they could stay the individual they were. They could stay the nice person. The woman could maintain that whatever feminine quality she wanted to without becoming macho. The guy who was macho could develop soft, flowing, explosive techniques without being effeminate. I mean, there was a balance in the way that it was designed and structured so that it would fit our culture without it becoming, again, that macho mentality that most people think of in the martial arts, the tough guy. Yeah, that's Neanderthal thinking and past.
Now, with Wing Chun Do, again, in the evolution of the different arts that Bruce Lee taught, and eventually with the understanding of, we don't even like to use it again, as we say, it's not an art, it's not a style, it's not a system. The understanding of what is known as Jeet Kune Do, for lack of a better term. You didn't get it. You were. Before that, a lot of people don't realize that you were there in the early days in Seattle, before he went to California, before the days of Dan Inosanto and many other people are involved in the evolutionary process in that concept. So, but yet, you've achieved the same goal. As far as the understandings of tailoring the art to the individual.
I think the thing you have to understand, over the years I've heard this thing, Jeet Kune Do, and people, and I know Dan Inosanto, have tremendous respect for him. But the thing I've always felt about Jeet Kune Do is it didn't exist. I felt that it was something that was going to become real, and that Bruce had this dream of bringing all these various elements that he'd been studying or heard about or whatever, and develop a real definitive style that was more martial arts than fighting. I mean, in other words, he was really wanting to do something from a martial arts standpoint. However, there was a distinct difference between the early years when he wanted to be a fighter. Everything when you're a fighter, mentally, the way you focus or the way you train is totally different than when you're thinking of the art itself, the broader spectrum. So Bruce went through what we consider 3 basic phases. The punk kid level, where he was wanting to be a fighter. He was just Bruce Lee wanting to be the best. Then he developed a skill that he felt very confident in, but he needed to make some money now to get out into the world because he didn't have an income. So he began to teach martial arts. but he didn't want to teach how he really fought because he didn't want to create a competitor. So, because he began to do things that we didn't like. We thought, gee, that wasn't efficient. Why are you doing this and that? So we questioned him. And Bruce would say, shh, why should I teach someone to beat me? Well, it's true. It's true.
Why should I?
However, all the people that trained didn't know the difference. So therefore, they took as gospel everything Bruce did as if, well, Bruce is going from step 1 to step 2, and therefore it's better. And step 3, it's better. No. Bruce only spent time relative to, in my perception, relative to applied fighting concepts in the first few years. He took a lot of information and turned it into personal information. He'd get from different systems. Professor J, of course, was a tremendous influence in Bruce's life. There were a number of people that Bruce respected, but he would take it on a personal basis for himself. But once he entered the mode of teaching someone else, he lost interest relative to the purity, the efficiency, the refinement of the fighting skills, and now he was doing it for money. He wanted to make money to get away from where he was living. However, then he went to Hollywood. He wanted to become a movie star. So all of a sudden, everything began to take on a more exaggerated motion, more visual, things that were definitely more picture-orientated. He began to think in those terms, and that's why Jeet Kune Do is much more visual, much more exaggerated in many ways. His stance changed. A lot of things changed that us in the old days, the early guys would say, oh, yeah, it's great. However, why do you do that? Because if you do this, you could negate that. So from our standpoint, when we look, and we mean no disrespect to the later years, we just like people to know that Bruce Lee did changes not because he wanted to evolve as a higher level of fighter, but he had already done that. Now he wanted to become Bruce Lee, the movie star, Bruce Lee, somebody else other than a fighter. So that's where his energy was going. And that's why there's such a distinct difference in these different separation and influence in these different levels. So the fighting stage was the punk kid. The kid that I knew was Bruce Lee, not Bruce Lee, the amazing martial artist, but Bruce Lee, the tough kid who knew some really neat stuff. And so Jeet Kune Do, to me, it's like a big word that has no meaning whatsoever, and they make it even worse by giving it a vagueness, a romanticism lost in mysticism of, do your own thing, Well, I mean, that's a little too vague for the student who doesn't know how to do anything. And Bruce's thing was, if you're going to train, you want quick, positive results. And the present-day Jeet Kune Do, from I've seen it, you talk to 5 Jeet Kune Do guys, you're going 5 different Jeet Kune Do.
Exactly.
And again, no disrespect, but if a person wants to learn something, then what is that something? And JKD is not a specific thing. And in order to learn something, it needs to be more structured as a specific thing to follow, to learn. And so this is the problem today, in the present day, relative to trying to define martial arts and what is a system and what is JKD and whatever.